This is brought to you jointly by the Foundation for the National Interest, UP Institute for Maritime Affairs and the Law of the Sea, and the Embassy of the United States of America. I am Jesse Pascasio, and I will be moderating today's discussions. Today's topic is one of the hottest issues in the region, China's gray zone tactics and the role of its maritime militia. While the presence of these militia vessels has been a much discussed and debated topic in the academic and government circles, the origins and organization of these forces are still insufficiently understood. This morning, we are privileged with the presence of a recognized expert on this issue, and we thank him for accepting our invitation despite the significant time zone difference. Allow me right now to introduce our speaker. Dr. Andrew S. Erickson is a professor of strategy in the U.S. Naval War College's China Maritime Studies Institute, or CMSI. As a core founding member, he helped establish CMSI and stand it up officially in 2006 and has played an integral role in its development. Dr. Erickson has presented extensively at academic, private sector, and government institutions throughout the United States and Asia. He has briefed a broad array of senior U.S. and foreign policy makers and principals, and internationally, many high-level officials, including the heads of multiple foreign navies and other government organizations. Dr. Erickson testifies periodically before such congressional bodies as the House Foreign Affairs and the Armed Services Committees and U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Dr. Erickson received his PhD and MA in politics from Princeton University and graduated magna cum laude from Amherst College. He took many courses at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. He studied Mandarin in the Princeton in Beijing program at Beijing Normal University's College of Chinese Language and Culture. And he studied Japanese language, politics, and economics in the year-long associated Kyoto program at Doshisha University. His research focuses on Indo-Asia Pacific defense, international relations, technology, and resource issues. He has envisioned, developed, and led a path-breaking 6+ year project to uncover China's critically important but insufficiently understood maritime militia. He co-authored China Maritime Report No. 1, China's Third Sea Force, and it inaugurated a series of timely CMSI studies and has been extensively used by government intelligence and security services in Asia and beyond. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm giving now the floor to Dr. Andrew Erickson. Andrew, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and it's a true honor and pleasure to have a discussion this morning with such an important and influential group. I've long believed that China's maritime militia development and gray zone operations are one of the most important dynamics in our times that have not been sufficiently understood and countered. So I'd like to share some ideas about that. If we could go to my slides, I believe yes, thank you very much. So, of course, these are all just my personal academic views as a civilian scholar. They're based on my analysis of open sources, including Chinese language sources, as well as some interactions over the years with some Chinese individuals and officials, but again, just my personal views. In the bottom right corner, we can see a photograph of me helping to escort then Commander of China's Navy, Admiral Wu Shangli, around Harvard. So that's an example of a chance to hear directly from Chinese officials and experts. And I'll share at the end of the presentation links to my personal research website, andrewerickson.com, where I have a compilation posting of everything I can find on China's maritime militia that I think it's worth looking at and seems reasonably argued to me, or good data. But on the bottom left of this slide, I have a means to contact me, as well as the access information to my internal website, where I post some of the research that can't be posted on the open internet for copyright reasons. All right, next, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I won't belabor the point here because in this audience, I know there are many experts on the South China Sea, including the features that China claims, a variety of disputed features. This is one of the graphics from the China Maritime Studies Institute's edited volume on China's maritime gray zone operations. I would call your attention specifically to the asterisk marks here. This was our best effort to show where we thought China had been engaged in various gray zone incidents over the years. I know there are experts in this group who will have a more precise knowledge and understanding, but this was our effort to at least show the wide distribution throughout the South China Sea of these gray zone incidents involving China. Next slide, please. Again, I'm deeply respectful of the expertise in the audience, but I would like to emphasize the importance of looking at China's maritime forces from a three sea force perspective, not just China's Navy, not just China's Coast Guard, but also the Maritime Militia. Now, in this graphic from China's Navy's, the U.S. Navy's strategic report of late last year. This is public information from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. If you total up the number of vessels that China's three sea forces are credited with by ONI, in 2021, it's already over 700. And obviously, this is just a graphical representation, but to my eyes, this line shows layer shows about 90 maritime militia vessels. I would submit to you that even if we're just counting the very most advanced and capable units, that is probably an overly conservative estimate. I think the number should be higher. We can discuss that further if anyone's interested. But regardless, this is already an extraordinary set of numbers. The world's three largest sea forces of their type by number of ships. And quantity is not everything, but it sure matters when it comes to presence in gray zone operations. Next slide, please. So I always emphasize the way in which China's three major armed forces each have their own fleet, their own sea force. And everybody knows about China's Navy under the PLA. Many know that since 2018, China's Coast Guard has been subordinated to the People's Armed Police and hence directly in China's armed forces. But at least in some public media and broader discussions in the United States and beyond, there are all different ways in which China's maritime militia is referenced, often using imperfect wording that doesn't show recognition of its status as a clear component of China's armed forces. So that's one point I want to underscore today. Next slide, please. This is the latest unclassified recognition guide from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence. I'm hoping they'll update it soon, but the larger points will remain clear no matter how many times they update it. And that is, look at the sheer variety of classes of vessels in China's three major sea forces. Look at the sheer, especially if you look at this with a magnifying glass or by other means, look more closely, look at the sheer number of pennant numbers. And I've expanded out here on the right-hand side from the box, the major maritime militia classes that ONI is already starting to track. Next slide, please. Now, here is a supplement order of battle that I would recommend. It's called Modern Chinese Maritime Forces. It's updated on a quarterly basis. You can find complete information via my website. It has 2 pages here on China's maritime militia and pieces together some additional data. This is all a work in progress, of course, but I believe that using open sources alone, there's a lot that we can learn and share about this sea force. It is by no means plausibly deniable on China's part, nor unknowable on our part. Next slide, please. And this is just the second part of that that 2-part section in this volume, which I highly recommend. It has revealing silhouettes of all of China's 3 sea forces major ship classes, which I think is a great way to visualize it, especially for a broader audience or a non-expert audience for whom each picture might truly be worth 1,000 words, so to speak. Next slide, please. Now, looking more specifically into China's maritime militia, I know there are those in the audience who have great knowledge of it. There are too many details to discuss tonight, so I'll try to cover the high points. If you go again to this compilation on my research website, you can find a high level of detail of a wide variety of sub areas of this force. Broadly speaking, this is a force with a multi-decade history dating at least back to the founding of the People's Republic in 1949. It's been strengthened considerably over the years, even as it continues to draw on China's fishing fleet, the world's largest, and its other coastal marine economy economic sectors. That's where some of the other maritime militia personnel come from. You can think of this as a very large pyramid. There's an enormous base of low capability, fairly simple vessels and crews of very basic training engaged in things in ports and supporting activities along the coast. I don't think that represents a significant concern to the Philippines, to the U.S., to any other U.S. ally in the region. But unfortunately for us, there's also an increasingly capable elite tip to that pyramid. The elite tip to the pyramid essentially can be divided into 2 parts. There's part-time and there is full-time, and I'll go more into detail on that. But both of those are capable parts, and both have had units engaged in international sea incidents involving especially Philippine government vessels, but also those of the United States and some other regional vessels. Next slide, please. Again, China's fishing fleet serves as a very large supply of personnel of varying levels of capability, but the ones that are more capable are trained with a variety of tasks to support maritime militia missions, and this includes training to promote, uphold, and advance China's disputed sovereignty claims in various ways, and even training for a variety of wartime missions. It's possible to debate how effective various maritime militia forces might be in wartime, but what is quite clear is that demonstrably authoritative Chinese publications talk seriously about advanced maritime militia units training for a variety of wartime support activities, tasks, things of that nature. Happy to discuss that further on. Next slide, please. again, as the saying goes, train as you will fight, or train as you aspire to operate. By this standard, China's maritime militia is not just developing and being promoted for theoretical reasons. The more advanced units are engaged in a range of serious exercises. And these include exercises involving maritime militia forces, Coast Guard forces, and Navy forces. There's an increasing integration among China's three sea forces, both in training and in operations. And for those who may not have had a chance to read it yet, I highly recommend the Pentagon's annual report to Congress on China's military development, informally called the China Military Power Report. The last few years have had good coverage of China's maritime militia, and the 2020 report, the best report yet in my estimation, has a detailed section that includes the maritime militia, but under the organizing theme of the increasing integration of China's sea forces. So obviously that is an authoritative U.S. government document. My research is academic and not authoritative, but I note with a great degree of satisfaction the way in which the findings of me and my colleagues over the last 7 years and our publications match very closely the statements that are made in the Pentagon's China report and other U.S. government documents. So to me, that says something positive about the reliability of our findings. Personally, I think it speaks to the power of open sources to shed light on what China is doing. As I like to say, China is usually considerably more transparent in the Chinese language. Next slide, please. And here are more examples of what open sources alone can reveal. This is described further in our various publications, but facing the East China Sea, including to some extent Taiwan, if you look at the coast of Zhejiang province, there are quite a number of advanced maritime militia units. Again, in our research, we ignore largely the less advanced ones because they're not trained or empowered to engage in international sea incidents with Philippine government vessels, with U.S. government vessels, with those of other allies in the region, et cetera. But even if you just use open sources, even if you just focus on these elite units, look at all the key units that can be found in this province alone. I think that says a lot, both about open source research and about just how extensive this maritime militia organizational network truly is. Next slide, please. And I'm sure we may discuss command and control and organizational structure for China's maritime militia, how it fits as part of China's armed forces. There's a lot to say about that. What I'd emphasize for you here is, again, in this latest Pentagon China report, China's maritime militia, the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, is featured directly in this organizational diagram, as we can see on the bottom right here. Next slide, please. And in our edited volume at the China Maritime Studies Institute at the U.S. Naval War College, we offer our own organizational diagram. This gets very complex because it attempts to reflect a rather complex structure more completely. But for those who are truly interested in these details, we explain exactly what we're representing in this chart here. The key takeaways are China's maritime militia units, while grassroots in nature, are managed by the PLA, starting with the grassroots level of the PLA in the form of People's Armed Forces departments, and through a chain of command, this goes all the way up to the Central Military Commission and Commander-in-Chief Xi Jinping himself. That's an important point to underscore here. Next slide, please. Again, training, training, especially with the PLA Navy as well as the Coast Guard. We see many examples of this. We document many examples of this in our published research. Next slide, please. And as I was saying before, the Maritime Militia is charged in part with being able to support a range of military missions or military scenarios, wartime scenarios, naval scenarios. For years, we've seen mentions, descriptions, and photographs of maritime militia involvement in various types of mine warfare exercises. We also see mentions of maritime militia in preparation to engage in a variety of deception activities, such as to disguise themselves through the use of chaff and corner reflectors to either minimize their own signatures or actually perhaps to maximize their signatures to provide a decoy or a confusion effect. Now, I'm not a technical expert. I haven't analyzed how effective that might actually be in practice, but time and time again, we see mentions of this type of training in authoritative PLA publications, PLA-related publications. So we see every reason to take this prospect seriously. Next slide, please. Now, moving on to the South China Sea focused elements of China's maritime militia. Historically, the basing for the advanced units has been on Hainan Island proper, and here are some of those most advanced units. The vast majority of these have been engaged in international sea incidents over the years in the South China Sea, including multiple ones involving the Philippines, as I'm sure many in this audience know only too well, as well as Vietnam, and even through the impeccable incident of 2009, a U.S. government vessel being directly harassed and affected. Next slide, please. So the traditional, a key example of the traditional model for China's advanced maritime militia units is the Tanmen militia. And in typical PRC style, it was formally hailed as a model unit and recognized as such during Xi Jinping's visit a number of years ago, around 2013. 2013, I believe. And then it was studied as a model, and the Sansha Maritime Militia, the Sansha City Maritime Militia, that I'll talk about in a minute, that is a direct outgrowth of the Tanmen model, but taking it to a whole other level. So again, there are many data points in the study of China's maritime militia, but there are simplifying factors and patterns that we can take advantage of in our open source analysis. And I think this is true of governments following the issue as well. We call it an analytical saving grace that there are only a limited number of advanced so-called vanguard units charged with engagement in international sea incidents. Therefore, we try to focus our attention on those units. And then the most influential of those units that become model units then have disproportionate influence as models for the next set of advanced units. And we may expect that pattern to likely continue into the future. Next slide, please. Another key traditional vanguard maritime militia is the Sanya Maritime Militia. I mentioned the impeccable incident. Those familiar with it will remember this vessel. Quite unlike a normal fishing vessel in its persistent harassment, attempted snagging of the towed array sonar with a grappling hook. Well, we've traced it directly in detail. This is the key. Part of the key was searching for this hull number and looking for ways in which it appeared in Chinese language sources. And I'll get to the importance of hull numbers later. And I think that's very relevant to some of the issues that are happening today at Whitsun Reef and beyond. It's my personal regret that the U.S. government at the time did not mention that this was a maritime militia vessel, nor appeared to impose a cost on China for operating in this way. And again, I'm at liberty to say this as a civilian academic. I have that freedom. I'm not trying to be flippant here. This is a sincere concern that I have. I know it's always easier to say this than actually solve the problem, but I do think China's maritime militia becomes less effective the more we shine a spotlight on it and call it out. And it's my personal belief in hindsight that had we, meaning people on the US side, called out China's maritime militia earlier, say as early as 2009, some of these other incidents might not have gotten to the level that they did. Moving forward, I think we can continue to do a much better job in deterring that, and I'll be happy to elaborate. Next slide, please. So another international sea incident, another example, I think, of particular relevance here in the Philippines is the harassing presence of China's maritime militia at Second Thomas Shoal, and also the implicit, at least implicit, capability of China to swarm many more vessels around Second Thomas Shoal, or another feature that China claims to try to envelop it coercively and prevent, try to prevent, resupply vessels from getting there. So this is a way in which the Sanya Maritime Militia, no longer China's most advanced, but still in the top group, has played an actual frontline role. This is not just theoretical. Next slide, please. One of the phrases that comes up in Chinese sources is using civilians against civilians. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a legal expert. I have concerns about using the term civilian to describe China's maritime militia or elements of China's maritime militia. I understand why this is a convenient narrative for China, which tries to obscure and obfuscate. I'm skeptical that that's the right term, given that China's maritime militia is part of its armed forces. But surely there are maritime legal experts in the audience who have a much more sophisticated notion than I do. I think the key takeaway here is that China sees the maritime militia as a particularly valuable force when it's trying to control escalation, make progress well, as China sees it, finally calibrating and limiting the level of escalation. So here we see the HYSY 981 oil rig, and in that incident with Vietnam in 2014, China saw value in using its maritime militia extensively to try to sort of flood the zone with numbers that Vietnam couldn't match, even though Vietnam was obviously highly motivated to do so given the stakes. So this is another example of frontline maritime militia involvement, albeit one that didn't directly involve the US and the Philippines at the time. Next slide, please. But the new model, we've talked thus far about part-time elite maritime militias, and those are potent. They can be activated and called into service, and they can play a major frontline role. And a key example of that, of course, is Tanmen maritime militia involvement in the tragic Scarborough Shoal incident, which I know many are true experts on, so I won't I won't belabor that point right now. Moving on to the full-time professional models, this has really been pioneered by Sansha City, the new model, if you will, which several years ago received 84 purpose-built maritime militia vessels, larger and more capable than the vast majority of fishing vessels in the region. Again, in the research at CMSI, we have a lot of details on those vessels, where they're built, some of their specific characteristics. So there's a lot more on that. The big picture, though, is these are far more capable vessels than most of the other ones in the region, save for other regional navies and regional coast guards to some extent. But this gives China a lot of options, and these vessels are crewed by highly professional, even militarized crews. These crews are recruited from PLA veterans in large part. They're attracted by large salaries and extensive, very attractive benefits. And we, in our research at CMSI, have never found any evidence of them actually fishing, and more on that in a minute. But this is very telling. These are not by any reasonable definition fishing vessels, a fisherman, fisherwoman, fisher folk, a fishing fleet. But China keeps trying to obfuscate, and as recently as the Whitsun Reef situation, which I'll get to in a minute, just blatant. Well, I would colloquially I would call it lying. I realize that's an inflammatory term, but making official PRC statements that are obviously not true if you actually know what's happening at Whitsun Reef and elsewhere. Next slide, please. So in going into depth on the Sansha Maritime Militia, it's amazing to me how China attempts to downplay or pretend that it doesn't really have a maritime militia, or it's not that significant. It's also amazing to me that people outside China haven't done a better job calling it out. But again, this is hiding in plain sight. The Sansha Maritime Militia has made its own music video, and I don't know if we're able to play that. I think it's a nice example of just how out in the open this is. If we can play it, that's great. If that. Okay, let's just watch this. It's only 2 minutes and 13 seconds, but I think it's a great encapsulation of how serious this all is. And I've shared the lyrics on the next PowerPoint slide, so if anyone's interested, we'll soon see those. Please go ahead with the video.
斗海浪迎朝阳，海上民兵迎转阳，时代耕耘输送海，地海担心筑海疆。煽风云为梦想，海上民兵斗志昂扬，不畏艰险担使命，剑色闪洒闯辉煌。海上民兵海将卫士，报效国家忠诚于党。海上民兵海将卫士，报效国家忠诚于党。挺身为权当先锋，即使参战大胜仗。 山上海上民兵，战风云为梦想，海上民兵斗志昂扬，不畏艰险担使命， 是三沙闯辉煌。海上民兵还在为师，报效国家终身履当。海上民兵还在为师，报效国家终身履当。立誓为权当先锋，继续参战打胜仗，自豪吧！我们是三沙海上民兵，前进吧！我们是三沙海上民兵。
So I think that's a useful encapsulation, and if we could go to the next slide, please. Personally, and I don't mean this as a joke, I think the next time Chinese officials or Chinese interlocutors make some completely unfactual statement that at least implies that China doesn't have a maritime militia, or the maritime militia is not really existing or significant, let's play them this music video. It's an official production, and it shows some very serious things. This is not fishing. Here are the lyrics, and I've just highlighted the two lines repeated that I think are the most important. In peacetime, the Sansha Maritime Militia is to be, quote, the vanguard of rights protection, meaning its job is to be involved in various upholding and advancing PRC sovereignty claims where they're disputed in the South China Sea, and then in times of emergency, join the battle and win the war. Lots more to say about those details, but this shows you what the maritime militia of Sansha City is designed to do. There's nothing about fishing here specifically. That's not their job, even though they're connected with those communities in China. Next slide, please. And one of the peacetime missions is engaging in rotational forward deployments to key features in the South China Sea that China claims. And this top right photograph, I believe, with Sansha Maritime Militia vessels and a Philippine set of Philippine fishermen, that's obviously an extreme case in this disparity between the vessels. But in all too many cases, I believe for virtually any fisherman, any fishers, these vessels can be extremely intimidating, even if they're not spraying with their powerful mast-mounted water cannons or ramming with their reinforced steel hulls. And if you track the open source AIS data over time, you can see very regular deployments of these vessels. If we could have the next slide, please. Again, typically say a 45 to a 90-day cycle of deployment to these different key features. And sometimes from satellite imagery, you can see these maritime militia vessels docking at various PRC outposts, particularly the key outposts in the Spratlys. One thing that makes the Sansha Maritime Militia so easy to follow is that these are distinctive looking large vessels that in our experience typically keep their AIS signals on. So maybe in our discussion afterwards we'll have some discussion about how to distinguish and what that all means. Well, I'm not saying it's equally easy for all vessels, but the 84 Sansha vessels I think are particularly easy to recognize, follow, define and distinguish from other vessels. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to go through a brief, as we come to the end here, I'm going to go through a brief slide deck that my colleague Ryan Martinson and I have posted online as part of our latest series of articles regarding Whitsun Reef. So this is widely available. There's a link in the foreign policy article where we published it. There's a link available on my website. We're trying to get the word out, because not only is the Sansha Maritime Militia knowable, but out of Guangdong province, there's another advanced maritime militia that clearly has a frontline role, and its vessels we've documented, we feel conclusively, to have been at Whitsun Reef, including during the time that China, in official statements, claimed that they weren't there. So I know we're short on time. Let's just go to the next slide, and I'll. So this is the location of the basing of the Maritime Militia Unit. Guangdong is the most prosperous province of China, developed marine economy, logical spot for such an advanced unit. Next slide, please. Again, from open sources, we can find the 9 key vessels, their MMSI numbers, all these details, photographs. We list some of these sources. Next slide, please. We're able to see the history of their development. This phrase backbone is quite significant. My colleague Ryan Martinson just published new research. He thinks the Chinese term for backbone is in effect a code word, or almost a cover designation for maritime militia vessels. If that's true, I think we can much more systematically identify these key units. So we'll work on that moving forward. But already here are 9 key vessels in this so-called Far Seas Militia Squadron. Next slide, please. And notably, at the delivery ceremony, there are 2 representatives from the local military sub-district, PLA representatives. This is no coincidence. It all fits together in terms of how the maritime militia is organized and operated. Next slide, please. And we see the director of the local Bureau of Veterans Affairs visiting. His organization is an example of how PLA veterans are recruited to crew and to command these leading maritime militia vessels. Next slide, please. And the next few slides have they show AIS tracks from marine traffic that we've superimposed. Here's the bottom line. No fishing vessel would operate in such a regular focused pattern to go to disputed features. Yet this Far Seas Militia Squadron's vessels have done just that. Next slide, please. Including, if we zoom in, their regular presence around Subi Reef, Union Banks, where Whitsun Reef is located, and Mischief Reef. Next slide, please. Now, if we look more specifically at Union Banks, we can see the extensive coverage of all of Union Banks, including the lagoon at Whitsun Reef. Next slide, please. Now, if we just look at March of this year, during which China made 2 official statements that, to me, sounded like China was denying categorically the presence of maritime militia vessels at Whitsun Reef. In fact, we can see multiple visits to the Whitsun Reef Lagoon by these specifically identified maritime militia vessels. So to me, this is the way in which open sources can be used to show that China wasn't telling the truth and was trying to hide things. Next slide, please. And this is just a broader compilation of other Chinese vessels that have been identified at Whitsun Reef, some others of which may also be maritime militia vessels. Next slide, please. So let me just stop here. I have some additional slides in the overflow slides category. Anyone who's interested can look at those later. This link goes to our latest, my latest compilation of maritime militia sources. It's all keyword searchable. And let me just conclude by saying, as good as open source research as a tool, it has its limitations. And on this latest research concerning Whitsun Reef, Ryan Martinson and I struggled for a long time to draw a clear maritime militia connection. We were close, but we were one link in the chain unsure. What put us over the top was the Philippines' release of images and video footage of the vessels at Whitsun Reef. We finally could get a close enough look at the hull numbers and the Chinese characters that went with them. And that was enough for us to then complete the chain. So I think that's one of the best things that's happened in maritime militia research in the past few years. And I hope there'll be more of this. And I've personally urged that others follow the good example of these photos out of the Philippines. That was just invaluable, and I think so much good came out of it. So again, my personal views, thank you very much. Delighted to continue this however is most useful to this very august group.
So on behalf of the Foundation for the National Interest, the UP IMLOS, and the U.S. Embassy in the Philippines, we thank Dr. Andrew Erickson for his invaluable contribution to the success of this webinar and for the participation of everyone in today's meeting. And we hope to see you in our next Kwentong Karagatan series. Thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure.